So thank you again. If I could just ask you to give us a little introduction, who you are and what your experience of loss is, Kristina.
Well, I'm Kristina Keneally. I'm a Labor Senator for New South Wales and currently the Shadow Minister for Immigration and Citizenship and Home Affairs.
So you sit around twiddling your thumbs then?
Yeah, well, there's a bit of free time, but not very much. That's correct. Yeah, so my experience of grief and loss is that 21 years ago, my daughter Caroline was stillborn. She was my second child between my oldest and youngest sons, and I was really stunned by the experience of becoming the mother of a stillborn baby, about giving birth to a stillborn baby, about having to grieve a stillborn baby. And it completely cleaved my life into before and after. And it was a tragedy I didn't realize could happen to a woman in pregnancy, and it is a horrible grief that I think is compounded by the fact that our society has really struggled to talk about stillbirth and pregnancy and infant loss. And it means that all too often families suffer that grief without the support of friends and family in a way that you might get in other circumstances of grief and loss.
What are some of the myths that you would like to address as the mother of a lost child?
Well, one of the challenges I always found as the mother of a stillborn daughter is that I never really knew how to answer that question, how many children do you have? And, I used to say 2 because I had 2 boys, and that always felt a bit wrong to me. That always felt a bit neglectful. It always felt a bit dishonest. And a couple of times it would lead to very, awkward circumstances. I remember one particular circumstance where this well-meaning woman started saying, well, wouldn't you like to have a girl? Why don't you try for a girl? And I kind of demurred a few times. And then finally I just said, look, I had a girl, she died. And I just said it. And I didn't mean to be so rude or abrupt, but I kind of realized after that I need to start saying that I have 3 children. And I need, when they say how old are they, I need to say, well, one is, 11 and one is 9 and the other one was a baby who died at birth. She was stillborn. And just make it part of my story and part of my narrative about who I am, because it is who I am. So I think there's that. I think there's also the myth about stillbirth is that it's something that happened in our grandmother's generation. And I remember thinking that after it happened to me, that, how could this happen? This is something that happened to my great-grandmother. And it did. My great-grandmother had 2 stillborn babies. And I kept thinking, how is it the case that I have ended up in a circumstance where I'm having a stillborn child and in this day and age? And, and I put that down to the fact that if you look through the pregnancy books, if you talk to your doctor or midwife, they don't often bring up stillbirth. And in the Senate, we recently had a Senate committee on stillbirth research and education. And we were hearing stories from mothers who had stillborn babies in the past 12 months. And they were saying the same thing, that they would go back to their doctors and say, why didn't you tell me this could happen? I mean, it happens 6 times a day in Australia. It happens
when you called for the inquiry, it was on the back of some pretty damning statistics that show that we have progressed very little in terms of the stillbirth statistics since in the 20 years since Caroline died. So how have we shifted? How are we doing?
Well, on the numbers, we haven't changed. That is the blunt reality. The rate, we've only been keeping records for about 20 years. And in those 20 years, we haven't had any movement at all. And, that's in contrast to places like the Netherlands and the United Kingdom and New Zealand and others that have made it a priority to reduce the stillbirth rate. and they have, in some places by as much as 60%. So there are reductions to be made, there are lives to be saved. We just need to make it a national priority and change the way we both investigate stillbirth and the way that we provide prenatal care and advice to expectant mothers, as well as advice and training to doctors and midwives.
Why are we dragging the chain so much in this conversation? Why is there such a skittishness to talk about it? And you know, in actual fact, grief in its entirety, but this is a particularly taboo subject when it really shouldn't be. This is 2020.
Yeah, that's a great observation, because I think the fact that we don't talk about it is part of the reason we haven't treated it as a public health problem. You know, something, if you can imagine in any other circumstance, if 5-year-olds were dying every day of something, we would take action. And I think it's partly because people have seen it as such a terrible grief that they don't even want to enter into the experience, and I can understand that. I think for a long time in medical practice, we saw it as just something that happens, and it happens inside a woman's body, and therefore it's, probably not as important. And really, up until, my mother's generation, women were told to just go home and forget about it.
Yeah.
And so we haven't seen it for what it is, which is a public health problem. And so what was been most amazing about the experience of the Senate inquiry was the extent to which so many people wanted to tell their story. And we had mothers who'd had stillborn babies 30 years ago, and we'd had mothers who'd had stillborn babies 3 months before they came and gave evidence. And all of them just wanted to make sure that the Senate, and by extension the government, understood that this was a public health problem. It was a private grief. And in those cases where it's preventable or avoidable, we should be taking steps to do it. We lose 2,200 babies a year. It's the #1 killer of children under 1. And, it's higher than the national road toll, the stillbirth death rate. So
you're quite right. If we were talking about road accidents, that we would be marching in the streets. Is that one of the reasons that a day like the International Day of Infant and Pregnancy Loss is so important? To have a day that we recognise those losses?
I think anything that we can do, like Infant Loss and Pregnancy Loss Day, to be able to allow people to, one, remember, if they've never had a direct experience of it, that this happens. 2, for people to realize that the wider community does see and recognize their loss. And 3, to let people talk about it. And I think that's the most important thing. I often get asked, by people saying, my sister had a stillborn baby, or my friend had a stillborn baby, what should I do? And, my first response is, you should acknowledge that baby by its name, and you should remember its birthday, and you should, never feel hesitant to bring the baby up in conversation with your friend or family member, because they are the parent of that baby and they remember that child. And what's the most comforting thing is that someone else does too.
How do you remember Caroline? What do you do to mark her life and her death?
Well, we were very fortunate, and I don't think I realized how fortunate we were until the Senate inquiry. We were very fortunate that even 20 years ago, we had an amazing social worker and team of people at the hospital that did things like take photos of her, take her handprints and footprints, take photos of us with her. And so we were able to create, photographic memorials of her that are in our house. We always make sure she's acknowledged in things like family, if when a grandparent dies, she's acknowledged in the list of grandchildren. But personally, we go to her grave as a family on her birthday. And I try to go to her grave once a month. It's, in my view, it's my way of parenting her. My children are now in their 20s, all of them, and this is the thing that I do, and I bring flowers and I look after the gravesite, because that is the way that I can continue to parent her and look after her, and make sure that the memory of her that's memorialized at that grave is preserved.
You've been in the public eye now for quite a long time in various iterations. How has that public persona, has that been a help or a hindrance? And talking about Caroline, or a bit of both?
Well, two things that have two things I'll reflect upon in answering that question. One, I'm not sure I ever would have ended up in the public eye except for the experience of being Caroline's mother. And it's not that I recovered from my grief and decided I was going to run from Parliament and make stillbirth a mission. That wasn't it at all. It was more the sense that when I did run for Parliament, and when I first got into politics, and I realized the kind of political attacks that my opponents, verbally would launch, just didn't matter to me. Like, it was the sense of, come on, I have survived something so much worse. It's like, it's almost, yeah, exactly. It's almost impossible for you to hurt me any more than I have already been hurt. So whatever. Yeah. And I think that in reflection upon that, I think that we often think of strength or courage as a male thing, muscle up, man up, show some balls, whatever. And I think there's so many experiences that women have in their lives, and giving birth is one of them, and particularly giving birth to a stillborn baby. If you survive that, you're a strong person. And you can really, I say that being Caroline's mother, she's made me almost fearless. But your second part of your question is, I really didn't start talking about Caroline publicly. I mean, I acknowledged her in my first speech in the New South Wales Parliament in 2003, but I really didn't start talking about it publicly until about 2010, some 11 years after I'd had her. And I think that's partly a sense of my own sadness and sorrow, and not trusting myself not to break down. And then secondly, that I think I still felt like society really wasn't ready to hear about it. But what I have found is, since I started talking publicly, since I became the patron of the Stillbirth Foundation, I just get so many amazing letters and people coming up to talk to me about how it's enabled them, to talk about it. I had this amazing story of this family that they watched an interview that I did on television, this husband and wife, and they'd had a stillborn baby 40 years previously. And they never discussed him. They didn't even know where he was buried. And they wrote to me to say that, having watched my interview, they were going to go back to the hospital and find out what had happened to their baby boy, and decided to memorialize him and honor him, because they had felt this loss. And I thought, for 40 years in your marriage, that you've been carrying that grief around. It was amazing. And the idea that we haven't talked about that, and that society didn't give them a space to talk about it. So
that must be quite satisfying for you to feel that you have empowered. And I guess it sounds really cheesy, but that's Caroline's legacy too.
Well, what I did in the Senate when we delivered the report is, when we delivered the report, which was unanimously supported, the first national set of recommendations about driving down the rate of stillbirth, is that I named all of the babies whose parents had given evidence before the committee, because it's their legacy, right? Yeah. All of those babies, have a legacy there in that report, and their lives and the experience that their parents had of being their parents matters in that report, and hopefully will lead to other parents being able to hold and raise their children and to avoid the tragedy of stillbirth.
And Kristina, you speak so kindly and generously of parents as opposed to just mothers. I think we tend to focus on the mothers and the women. And I've read where you have said that your husband Ben was very supportive and obviously went through the journey with you. Do you think we need to acknowledge fathers in this equation as well?
Absolutely. And the stillbirth inquiry, we heard from fathers as well as mothers. We heard from a grandfather. We were on the committee. One of the senators, Senator Molan, was the grandfather of a stillborn baby, and that really motivated his participation. And I think for fathers, the grief is often different. and it is sometimes, I know from my own family and from other families I've spoken to, sometimes the father's grief comes much later as well, because they've spent so much time looking after their partner, and the physical demands of birth, and the grief that she is going through. And so I think for the partners, whether they're fathers or partners in a relationship where the non-birth parent really does carry a grief, and that should be acknowledged and supported as well.
One final question, and I'll let you get back to your busy life. What would you like the wider community to know about pregnancy and infant loss?
I'd like them to know that it does happen in a pregnancy, and that they have a right as an expectant parent to know that, and they have a right to hear that from their health practitioner, their doctor, or their midwife. And I say that in this context. I think the best illustration of this is we got in the Senate inquiry. One of the mothers said, she went back to her doctor and she said, "Why didn't you tell me this would happen? This could happen," I should say. And he said, "Well, I didn't want to worry you." And it's a very paternalistic attitude, right? And she made the point, she said, when you get on an airplane in any country in the world, they tell you the worst thing that could happen and how to prepare for it. And nobody runs screaming from the plane.
And interestingly, if you have a big toenail removed, they give you the worst case scenario.
That's right.
But, you're bringing new life into the world and they don't give you the worst case scenario. It's quite bizarre.
And the other thing is in that context, and to tell you, like they do on an airplane, the things that you can do to mitigate that risk. And there are things, there are things that we know about pregnancy and preventing stillbirth that we are not telling people. And there are things that we could know if we did the research and fed it back into clinical practice. And so that's what I would like the community to know. Stillbirth is not just one of those things that happens. There are steps you can take to reduce your risk. There are things that we could do better and differently in Australia. And there are babies' lives that could be saved. And therefore, it's important. It's a national health priority, and that we make it that so, if we're losing 2,200 babies a year and not asking what can we do to prevent it, well, we're poor as a society. So that's what I'd like the public to know, that there is something that we can do to reduce the risk of stillbirth.
Now, I said that was the last question, but I lied, because I'm personally very interested in how Caroline's loss, how did that shift the dynamic of your parenthood? How did that impact on you being a mum?
That's a really interesting question. I think I became strangely more relaxed as a parent. And I don't mean to say I had whatever happens, it's not like I wasn't concerned about my kids, but maybe I had a view that, the worst thing that could happen to a parent had already happened, and the chance of any other terrible thing happening was remote. Yeah, that's possibly a foolish thing to think, but it's probably did shape my thinking. But I think I also took a view that, life is short and you never know what is going to happen. And you can't control what is going to happen, and
so
therefore
I small stuff with parenting.
Yeah, and I couldn't wrap my kids in cotton wool and hope that nothing bad ever happened to them, because you just can't control what happens in life, and all you can control is how you react to it. So I wanted to give my kids a sense of resilience, and I wanted to give them a sense of freedom, and I also didn't want them to feel like their mother was constantly mourning the loss of their sister. I wanted them to feel like their mother was engaged in their life. I think strangely enough, it actually made me a much more relaxed parent. Maybe my kids would disagree. I don't know.
Maybe we'll come back in 20 years' time and ask them.
That's right.
Kristina, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute honour and pleasure to talk to you. Thank you, and thank you for all you're doing.
Thank you so much, Jen.